Happiness is not our right. It's an achievement. It's a bit of luck.
But this isn't a happy story. Orson Welles. At age 25, this boy wonder directed a movie that many consider to be the greatest film of all time, Citizen Kane. But when Citizen Kane was released in 1941, Orson Welles encountered a storm of controversy that haunted the rest of his career. Behind the scenes, Welles lived a life more fascinating than fiction, battling everyone from studio execs to media tycoons to his most dangerous enemy, himself.
I considered Orson Welles to be one of the geniuses of Hollywood. He was a rebel. He wouldn't play the game.
Orson, I think, in addition to his talent, had a self-destructive streak in him.
On this episode of Mysteries and Scandals, we'll zero in on why Welles lost his Hollywood halo and was considered washed up before he turned 30.
None of his movies ever made money. None of them, including Citizen Kane, never made money.
We'll also expose how the director and star of some of the most celebrated films became the joke of Hollywood.
It's considered widely that he was just disgracefully wasting his life, but that's far from the truth.
And we'll reveal the personal consequences of Orson's professional defeats.
I think that it's a miracle that a man who lived as recklessly as Welles did, in terms of eating and drinking and just not looking after himself, lived to be 70.
I'm A.J. Benza. Join me as we remember the on-screen magic and off-screen mayhem created by Orson Welles. Orson Welles enjoyed countless affairs and was married 3 times, including once to movie sex symbol Rita Hayworth. But on October 10, 1985, the 70-year-old filmmaker died alone. Welles historian Joseph McBride.
Welles had an obsession with fate and tragedy, and his films often start with the death of the main character, and then you work backwards to see how he came to that fate.
George Orson Welles was as complicated as any character he ever created on screen. His journey began on May 6, 1915.
Welles always thought it was ironic that he was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which seems a very prosaic birthplace for such an amazing, colorful figure.
Director Henry Jaglom was a friend to Orson Welles.
He just knew from early on that he was an artist and a performer.
Welles was regarded as a great prodigy. He was precociously intelligent, and everybody thought something great was going to come from him.
David Thompson is the author of Rosebud, the story of Orson Welles.
He never really had a genuine childhood, so he carried into adult life a lot of unresolved childish energies.
Also left unresolved was Orson's relationship with his parents. When Welles was 9, his mother Beatrice died of hepatitis. Orson's father Richard passed away just 6 years later.
Richard Welles died in 1930. He may not have literally committed suicide, but he drank himself to death, and Welles said he always blamed himself for that.
An orphan at 15, Welles became the master of his destiny. When he was 16, Orson took off for Europe. He wanted to be a professional actor, and he certainly met all the requirements. He was cocky, crafty, and convincing.
He presents himself at the Gate Theatre in Europe, and he says, "Gentlemen, my name is Orson Welles. You may have heard of me. I have done several things on the New York stage." He had done no things on the New York stage.
And they saw through the charade, but they were impressed by his chutzpah and his grandeur of personality, even though he was only a teenager.
So they gave him some parts, and his first professional appearances were in Dublin when he was 16.
Welles had real talent, and his performances impressed European audiences. In 1933, at age 18, Welles made his way back to the U.S. For the next several years, the gifted performer sharpened his theatrical skills. UCLA film professor Jonathan Kuntz.
He became known for his innovative productions on Broadway as both a director and as an actor.
In 1936, he's 21. He mounts an all-black production of Macbeth.
My name's Macbeth.
In a voodoo setting. He brings in voodoo drummers, really quite wild people from Haiti, and he does it up in Harlem. And everyone said that it was an extraordinary evening of theater.
Wells formed the Mercury Theater Company in 1937. A year later, the 23-year-old actor and director became the master of another medium, radio.
Wells had a very successful radio program called the Mercury Theater of the Air, and for Halloween 1938, the Mercury Theater dramatized The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. No relation to Orson Welles, of course.
The War of the Worlds came at a time when the world was very worried about war.
This was the year of the Munich Conference, of war clouds darkening over Europe, of great paranoia in the world, quite justifiable paranoia as it turned out, with World War II right around the corner.
And Wells very impudently adapted the H.G. Wells story about Martians invading the world.
Wells' dramatization of a UFO landing in a small New Jersey town proved to be almost too realistic.
He started off with a sort of corny musical show, and then he would cut away to news flashes.
We take you now to Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
I guess that's it. That's the thing directly in front of me, half buried in a vast pit. Must have struck with terrific force.
Some people tuned in after it started and they didn't get the disclaimers. And it was amazing that a lot of people believed it.
And the next day, of course, it was headlines, not just all over America, but all over the world.
Overnight, Orson Welles became an international phenomenon. And when you're that famous, it doesn't take long for Hollywood to take notice. Coming up, Welles makes the inevitable trek to Tinseltown and scores a directing opportunity of a lifetime. But Orson was about to lock horns with one of the most powerful men in the world, with devastating consequences. By the summer of 1939, 24-year-old Orson Welles was riding high after the success of his riveting radio production of The War of the Worlds. The ride wouldn't last long, but in the beginning, he was the Dream Factory's most envied newcomer.
Studios in Hollywood started clamoring for him, but he held out until he had a contract that guaranteed him complete control of the film Final Cut.
He took the RKO offer, the famous carte blanche offer, which gave him a contract to direct, produce, write, and act in 2 films. It was an extraordinary deal, which immediately, of course, earned him the fear and loathing of everyone in the film community.
Since the earliest days, it's a great tradition in Hollywood to not only want yourself to succeed, but to want everybody else to fail at the same time.
For a while, it looked like Orson Welles would fail. His first 2 projects stalled in development.
He was beginning to become a bit of a laughingstock, because here he was, the man who had had this great offer, and people were beginning to talk and say, well, the boy wonder is quite what he's cracked up to be.
Finally, in 1940, Orson Welles began production on a script he co-wrote with veteran scribe Herman Mankiewicz. The film was Citizen Kane.
Welles' first film, Citizen Kane, was a fiction film, but it was clearly based on the real-life story of William Randolph Hearst, the prominent newspaper publisher.
Citizen Kane cost $750,000 to make. That's about average for a studio film in 1940. But the executives at RKO weren't worried about the budget. They were worried about the story's main character, a cutthroat newspaper tycoon named Charles Foster Kane.
The trouble began principally after the film was shot, because word began to get out that this did, in certain ways, look awfully like William Randolph Hearst. And in 1940, 1941, Hearst was still a very powerful figure, controlled newspapers, radio stations, and so on.
Hearst was enraged by the unflattering portrait. Before the movie was released, the media mogul organized a counterattack.
It was within his power to instruct these newspapers and magazines to either to pan the film, or even worse still, ignore the film and block advertising for the film.
Welles became an enemy of one of the few men who could destroy his career. You see, Hearst had powerful allies throughout the studio system.
There was even an attempt by the rest of the film industry, led by Louis B. Mayer, who was really the West Coast chief at MGM, to buy the negative.
They offered to buy the film from RKO for what it cost and burn the negative. Can you believe this? And luckily, Welles managed to avert this, but it was a close call.
Orson Welles wasn't shy about his victory.
Welles claimed, and I'm sure it's true, that in San Francisco, when Kane was having its premiere up there, he ran into William Randolph Hearst in an elevator and very flamboyantly invited him to come to the preview of the film. And Hearst just stared at him and didn't say anything. And when Hearst was leaving the elevator, Welles looked at him and said, "Kane would have accepted."
In May of 1941, Citizen Kane was finally released. Hearst used every weapon in his empire to destroy the picture and attack Orson Welles. To a great extent, the publisher's campaign was effective, and the general public stayed away from theaters.
And so the film didn't make a profit in its initial release, so it was perceived as a commercial failure.
The critics, however, raved about Citizen Kane, calling the film a masterpiece. Cinematographer Gary Graver worked with Orson Welles in his later years.
People wrote after they saw Kane, they said, the review said, it's like you've never seen a film before. It was so different and so striking.
Kane got 9 Oscar nominations, but only 1 Oscar, which was the screenplay Oscar, which in a way was a slap in the face from Hollywood to Welles. They were sort of honoring Mankiewicz and basically saying, we're not going to honor you for directing it.
So in a way, Hearst won that battle, and it wasn't the last fight Orson Welles would lose. Straight ahead, a second chance at Hollywood glory. Would Orson find a new way to redeem himself? In 1941, 26-year-old Orson Welles was a critically acclaimed director who also produced, co-wrote, and starred in the controversial film Citizen Kane. Now, do you think the execs at RKO Studios rewarded the young filmmaker for his stellar achievements? No way. Welles was punished for making an enemy out of media tycoon William Randolph Hearst.
Because Kane didn't do well at the box office because of the controversy with Hearst, the studio forced Welles to renegotiate his contract.
Under his new deal, Welles had to give up control over the final cut of his next film.
The Magnificent Ambersons, which was Welles' second feature, was a Midwestern saga, a tragic story of a family in decline.
This was Welles' second chance to establish himself as a Hollywood player, but amazingly, as soon as shooting on The Magnificent Ambersons was completed, Welles disappeared.
He did not stay around in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, for the post-production, for the editing of the film.
Welles departed for Brazil on a pretty crazy venture.
He moved on to his next assignment for RKO called It's All True, in which was going to be a story built around the carnival in Rio.
The documentary It's All True was a World War II propaganda film.
The government had asked him to do It's All True, and he felt that it was his patriotic duty to make the film.
Sure, but nobody forced Orson to leave town before his other movie was finished. So why was he in such a hurry to get to Brazil?
I think he went because he loved South America. He loved the idea of carnival. He loved South American women.
A lot of people still attack him for supposedly abandoning the Ambersons in post-production.
But Welles didn't see it that way. He thought he could maintain control over Ambersons while shooting the documentary.
He communicated by telegram and by letter with RKO and with the crew who were editing the film.
He sent them memos about how to cut it and how to read what he wanted, and they ignored his memos.
In March of '42, RKO boss George Schaefer arranged a preview of the finished cut of The Magnificent Ambersons. The film was considered too dark for war-weary American audiences.
The studio took over the film in post-production and cut out about 45 minutes of the film and put a new ending on it. And it was one of the most tragic cases of the ruin of a great work of art in our culture.
You know, nobody would go to Picasso and say, I think there's too much red there, and I don't like the shape of that eye. Let's change that just a little bit.
As often happens in Hollywood, a film is valued more for profits than artistic merit. And when The Magnificent Ambersons wasn't a blockbuster, heads began to roll.
George Schaefer, who was really in charge of RKO at that time, and he was the man who brought Welles on board.
The head of the studio, George Schaefer, who had backed Welles on Kane, lost his job because of Ambersons.
Maybe the worst thing of all that happened to him was that the Brazilian project, It's All True, eventually collapsed, and the film was never completed.
Welles soon returned to the States. Desperate to save his own career, Orson produced, co-wrote, and starred in the 1943 film Journey into Fear. Sadly, it also failed at the box office.
So the combination of Kane, Ambersons, and Journey into Fear not being moneymakers, plus the management of RKO Studios changed and closed his office at RKO. He didn't have any contract, he didn't have any directing jobs. So he went to work as an actor.
Orson Welles once recalled that he began at the top and worked his way down, and the guy wasn't kidding. In 1943, at age 28, Hollywood's golden boy was labeled a failure. When we come back, Welles gets one last chance for a comeback. Plus, how did Orson win back Final Cut more than a decade after his death? In the mid-1940s, filmmaker Orson Welles was burned by the Hollywood studio system. For the next decade, Welles cooled off in Europe. He found work in several international productions like Macbeth, Othello, and The Third Man. In 1957, 42-year-old Welles returned to the United States. Film producer Rick Schmidlin.
Orson Welles had come back from Italy after living in Italy for about 10 years. He was acting in Hollywood, I think, to make some money and reestablish his relationships.
Academy Award-winning actor Charlton Heston.
His problem was never directing the picture, it was getting jobs, because he would make studios angry at him.
He had this terrible habit with studio executives of insulting them. He told them they had no taste. He alarmed them. He frightened them.
But the bosses at Universal Studios valued Orson as an actor. 42-year-old Welles was cast in a thriller originally called Badge of Evil. Charlton Heston was offered the leading role.
I got a call from Universal, who had given me a couple of scripts to read, and particularly one called Badge of Evil. And the guy on the phone said, "We haven't set a director yet, but we've got Orson Welles to play the heavy." And I said, "Why don't you have him direct? He's a pretty good director, you know." You'd have thought I asked that my mother direct.
The executives were so eager to attach Heston to the film that they reluctantly invited Orson to direct. Welles tried to play nice. He rewrote the script in 6 days and renamed the film Touch of Evil.
Well, Touch of Evil was his comeback to America, and ironically, the last film he did in America.
Excited about the project, Welles sent a telegram to actress Janet Leigh, who'd been offered a role in the film.
So I called my agent, and he said, "Oh, God, he wasn't supposed to call you. He wasn't supposed to contact you. You haven't seen a script. I haven't made a deal." And I said, "I don't care. I want to work with Orson Welles."
Welles wanted to prove he deserved another chance in Hollywood. So he planned a surprise for the first day of production on Touch of Evil.
The interrogation scene was the first thing Welles shot in the film. And the scene was scheduled for 3 days of shooting, and Welles rehearsed it all day long, and by midday, executives started appearing in the shadows.
Now the executives are getting really sweating. Oh my God, he's up to his old tricks. He hasn't made a shot today. What are we going to do? And we're ruined.
And he didn't roll the camera until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Now, everything had been worked out. He rolled camera, did it maybe 2 or 3 times, how many times he needed to get it. He had done it in one shot, continuous shot, and wrapped it up.
And he was 2 days ahead of schedule at the end of the first day of shooting, and he did this on purpose to kind of stun the executives.
Then we shot the film. We finished almost exactly on schedule, almost exactly on budget.
In June of 1957, after a one-day reshoot, Welles delivered what he considered to be his first cut of Touch of Evil.
Now, don't ask me what Welles was thinking, but once again, Orson left town before his film was officially completed. Welles took off for Mexico to star in another picture, and he foolishly entrusted the studio to finish the movie.
You can't do that. A director can't leave in the middle of editing a film. But that was Orson.
When he got back to Los Angeles in July, they had assigned another editor to do some clarifying.
Welles felt that the clarifying butchered his film. The frustrated director penned the now famous 58-page memo with his recommendations to save the project.
The studio took about 20% of the changes into account. The rest they totally ignored.
I'm afraid that when Touch of Evil came out, it was not a smash hit.
So in 1958, a defeated 43-year-old Orson Welles blew his Hollywood comeback. The studios wouldn't even consider hiring Welles to direct, so he turned his attention to acting.
You know, most people, when they get in a situation in Hollywood where people won't finance them, they just don't make any more movies. He was determined to keep making movies.
Welles never compromised as a director. He compromised totally as an actor. He would do anything basically for money as an actor.
And he probably poured all of that money right back into the production of his ill-fated later films.
But those later films never restored Welles to his former greatness. In 1985, Orson Welles died of a heart attack at the age of 70. Welles was reportedly found sitting at his typewriter, an artist till the very end.
The guy was a genius. He's one of the greatest filmmakers of the 20th century.
He was always edgy about the label genius. That's a kind of a heavy burden to bear, and I know he felt that way. But he was a fascinating man to work for.
He knew that if he had played things differently, he might have had a more easy career. But on the other hand, he was an artist. You know, art is considered a dirty word in Hollywood. He knew both that he had the regret and that there was no way he could have done anything differently.
In 1998, 13 years after his death, Touch of Evil was re-edited according to the 58-page memo written by Welles. Meanwhile, Citizen Kane is widely recognized as one of the best films ever, and Orson Welles is finally revered as a master of his art. He may have lost a lifetime of battles, but let's face it, the guy certainly won the war. I'm A.J. Benza. Join me the next time we peer into the backlots and back rooms of Hollywood's legends on Mysteries and Scandals.
This time, the credits are rolling down, and it seems to me you've got your ending, because we have come to the end. I'll say cut. I'm a director. Cut!